Yes, good afternoon, everyone, to our session, Balancing Climate Change Commitments in EU Trade Agreements, Sharing the Burden of the Green Transition. And it's a particular pleasure for me and my colleagues from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, CISDL, to be organizing this roundtable. My name is Marcus Gehring. My day job is to teach EU and international law at the University of Cambridge, and I'm here as lead counsel for sustainable trade. To my left is my colleague, Professor Ilaria Espa. Ilaria, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you so much, Marcus. I am Ilaria Espa. I am the lead counsel of the Natural Resources Program of CISDL, and it is my pleasure to be participating in this CISDL organized panel. But again, my daily job, as Marcus said, is Associate Professor of International Economic Law at USI Lugano and Senior Research Fellow at the World Trade Institute, where I actually do address these interlinkages between trade law and climate change, energy, commodities. So I'm very much looking forward to having a very nice discussion with you all. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, wow. My name is Giulia Pietrangeli. I actually come from the EU delegation to the UAE, work on development and humanitarian issues. In a past life, I was working actually on trade agreements, but that was a long time ago.
Fantastic. And
Hi, my name is Tumpa, and I'm a program assistant with the Economic Law and Policy Program at IISD.
excellent. And
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pierre Le Turc. I'm the head of program for global challenges and SDGs at IEP, a Brussels-based think tank, and I'm the coordinator of the Green Trade Network, to which CISDL is a member. So very happy to be here.
yes.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Dr. Manuel da Costa. I come from Timor-Leste. I'm the new member of the World Trade Organization. In Timor-Leste, I'm responsibility for exportation and importation agriculture product from foreign to Timor-Leste and from Timor-Leste to other country. So this is a good time for me and in between you all. Thank you very much.
Yes, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mateus Garcia. I'm a project coordinator at the CISDL, and I'm glad to not only to participate in the project and show our findings, but to be present here today. It's a pleasure.
Yes.
Hi, everyone.
And Marius.
My name is Marius Tokas. I'm the Trade and Investment Program Manager at CISDL, and my day job is a teaching assistant at the Geneva Graduate Institute, where I'm also finishing my PhD in international law.
Sam.
Thank you. So those of you who were at yesterday's session already heard this, but I wear a couple of different hats. I am simultaneously in private practice. I do policy work, and I'm also in academia. So I am a climate lawyer, qualified in Brazil and New York. First and foremost, I am also president of the Environmental Law Commission, the Brazilian Bar Association. I am a law professor in Brazil, and I am a legal fellow with CISDL.
Welcome, Alexander.
Hi, my name is Meral Uslu. I am the head of economic research in Istanbul Mineral and Metals Exporters Association, and I'm trying to learn how EU addresses climate change in the FTAs right now.
Yes, welcome.
I'm Mayra Souza. I work for International Flavors and Fragrance, that is in the food and beverage industry, but also some fragrances. I head of global trade policy.
Hi, I'm Stella Economiciu. I work for Enterprise Greece. It is a national trade promotion and investment facilitation agency, and we work under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Fantastic.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sophie. I'm the director of global advocacy at Fair Trade International. Glad to be
Welcome.
there.
Yes.
Hello everyone, my name is Lucian Cernat and I'm the head of Global Regulatory Cooperation and Public Procurement Negotiations at DG Trade, the European Commission. Thank you for having me here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. We are going to present some of the sort of research that we've done over the last 3 years. We started with a smaller research project where we asked the question, how does the draft Mercosur agreement benchmark against the most recent EU FTAs? We continued the research project by creating a community of practice mainly based in Latin America, and I should shout out to my colleague Javier Caceres, who's a professor at the University of Chile, who contributed significantly to this research, but is not here today. We then analyzed the NDCs under the Paris Agreement, and we asked the question, how can the EU help trading partners to better fulfill their own NDCs, right? So what kind of changes would you need in order to sort of make it easier for the trading partner not to achieve some sort of European objective, but rather achieve the objectives under the Paris Agreement that that particular trading partner has signed up to. And the beauty about the NDCs is they're publicly available documents, they're not as such binding, but they highlight the priorities that the trading partner has. And so my colleagues and I will be reporting on some of the results there. What we've done in the last year is, again, take a look at these bilateral relationships, EU-Mexico, EU-Central America, EU-Andes, EU-Chile, EU-Mercosur, and also EU-New Zealand, and asked what else is possible. Because we discovered in exchange with our colleagues, especially based in the region, that, for example, the EU Central America agreement was a very historic occasion, right? If you reopened the negotiations, you would probably not reach that kind of agreement again. So if we accept the political reality that some agreements can't be changed, what else can be done in order to, give more relevance to climate measures and maybe agree what I would call below the level of treaty change, some common positions that can actually help in the interpretation of these agreements. So we are here to sort of present some of the research and share some of the results. Those who are interested can also find the relevant papers on our website very soon. But before we do that, I would like to hand over to my colleagues. And I think we start with you, Alessandra.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for the introduction. Before I start, I wanted to congratulate our colleagues from Timor-Leste on the accession to the WTO. So I'll be happy to share a couple of our key findings with regard to Mercosur today. So being a Brazilian lawyer and academic, I was tasked with this part of the project concerning relations, trade relations, and particularly the FTA between the EU and Mercosur. As Marcus mentioned in the introduction, there have been to date mainly 3 iterations of our project. So we started back in, I guess it was 2021, looking very generally into how TSD clauses in the EU FTAs differ in different generations of agreements, and also keeping in mind that the Mercosur agreement is pretty much a product of another time, because even though it was finalized in 2019, negotiations started in the 90s, and therefore the TSD clauses pretty much did not reflect the state of the art and trade and sustainability negotiations. So the second iteration And the following year, with regard to Mercosur, as Marcus mentioned, we got to compare countries' trade profiles with priorities expressed in each Mercosur country's NDCs. And our key finding there was there is still a bit of a disconnect between what these countries actually export mainly and what their climate effort priorities actually are, which is of course a bit disheartening, but at the same time it holds promise because it shows there is room for improvement by means of policy work. And finally, in the current round of the project, we are analyzing how, on the one hand, negotiations of the EU Mercosur in their current state, and on the other hand, EU unilateral measures that have been flourishing in recent in the past couple of years affects one, the trade relations between the blocs generally, and two, how they could potentially impact domestic legal development on both trade and climate change. So, as I said, in the current iteration of our study, some of the unilateral measures we've been looking into are either proposals or recent directives regarding anti-deforestation, due diligence, greenwashing, the CBAM, of course, sustainable taxonomy, antitrust, and environmental crime. And you will notice that not all of these are directly related to trade, but we chose to look into this because they have pretty evident cross-border effects, and their effects can potentially span multiple jurisdictions and can potentially encompass global value chains as a whole. So I just think it's interesting to mention that, because this is, of course, quite recent, to mention the EU Parliament yesterday's vote on the criminalization of crimes comparable to ecocide. This is also interesting in the cross-border or extraterritoriality discussion, because EU countries will have up to 2 years to determine how this will play out internally, and also how this will potentially impact both EU companies operating overseas and non-EU companies operating in the EU. So this bilateral and unilateral approaches show, of course, that the EU has an important role as a significant force in shaping sustainability approaches to trade. But at the same time, it also creates resistance, significant concerns and criticisms by EU Latin American partners, not to mention internal resistance within the bloc, the European bloc. And of course, Mercosur is no exception. So just to, of course, we can go over this in a bit more detail later as we have our discussions on today's subject. Pretty much the gist of the current state of negotiations is that in February 2023, the EU proposed, it was actually a leaked document in which I'm not going to go over all the measures that were proposed in such documents, but it starts with the acknowledgement that 90% of deforestation in the world is due to the agricultural expansion, which of course is a sticking point for Mercosur. So Mercosur's response came a couple of months later, and it didn't go over a lot of detail, but it pretty much sent the message that Mercosur would not subject to any unilateral measures from their European partners. So we've been in this project following closely those developments. And I think regardless of what happens in the future, I just wanted to mention that the EU-Mercosur agreement is, in a way, it's unique because, of course, trade liberalization can entail effects with regard to deforestation in Mercosur, which is, of course, home to the Amazon rainforest. But at the same time, there is also reason for hope because there are studies establishing causal evidence in the sense that clauses, precisely the clauses and the legal scrubbing process that we're looking into right now, can be effective in protecting forests and biodiversity, and also can have a positive effect on greening exports of developing countries. So this is to highlight the importance of the work we've been doing in the sense that both as legal scholars and policymakers, it is really vital that we keep track of these developments and try and find ways in which, as legal scholars, we can contribute to the effectiveness of these clauses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. We go straight to Ilaria.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'd like to take perhaps a bit of a broader approach. Obviously, there's, I contributed to this project, and I'm delighted that I could contribute to this project. But perhaps I'd like to, in the light of the topic of today's panel, highlight a few of the findings that I presented in a paper that was also recently published in Journal of International Economic Law that is really very much complementary to the CISDL project, and how precisely the green transition and climate change related goals could actually also be promoted through EU FTAs by means of including energy sustainability related disciplines. Now, in the paper, I really look at the interplay between energy security and sustainability. Obviously, energy disciplines are not new in EU FTAs, but what is new is this ongoing and irreversible shift towards using energy discipline not only in an energy security-driven perspective, right? Trying to use trade rules to promote energy trade, to address availability of supply concerns, but really trying to incorporate sustainability-driven consideration into these energy provisions. The purpose being using trade rules to promote more environmentally sustainable energy trade and hence to foster climate change action. Now, in a nutshell, none of the provisions I'm going to elaborate upon are actually included in the EU Mercosur, and this is a bit the caveat here, but there are a number of examples that I can provide of energy sustainability-driven provisions that are included in a number of different chapters that are being negotiated in the latest generation of EU FTAs. That I think really tells us that the EU is looking at FTAs as a way to really try and include environmental sustainable trade conditions through energy. Now, if we were given only 4 to 5 minutes, but mainly I would focus on 2 clusters of provisions that you can find. On the one hand, those provisions that tackle tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade and investment, and on the other hand, you have the clusters of disciplines and subsidies. Now, of course, the level of ambition varies depending on the agreement, but with regard to the first cluster, you basically have a number of provisions that focus either on non-tariff barriers in the areas of renewable energy and energy efficiency specifically, and here this is also done through certain chapters, for instance, in the EU Vietnam, in the EU Singapore preferential trade agreements, and also a number of disciplines that focus on tariffs and non-tariff barriers on environmental goods and services more generally. With regards to the first categories, basically the main purpose is really to try and achieve conditions for regulatory convergence, so cooperation between regulators, standardization bodies to promote the development of common standards, mutual recognition, and these you find in a number of different agreements, right, from EU Mexico to EU Chile, and then obviously in EU New Zealand. And then when it comes to actually negotiating provisions on the liberalization, basically on environmental goods and services, here again you find different levels of ambition, but on the one hand this is basically cross-cutting, you find it in all of the PDAs, but in the latest one you have really the commitment to eliminate custom duties on extensive lists of environmental goods, right? And there is a heavy focus on renewable, low carbon energy, energy efficiency, climate change mitigation, adaptation technologies, and here again we have the New Zealand agreement. Now, when it comes to subsidies disciplines, you basically have, again, different levels of ambition, but you can basically see that there are some agreements that try to advance discussion on this issue of policy space for green subsidies. And you have here a number of examples, such as, again, the EU Singapore and EU Vietnam agreement, where you have more or less detailed exemption clauses, which state the primacy of policy interest, objective, and sort of a balancing exercise, but with different levels of normativities and enforceability. And then you have the high ambition hand of this agreement, where you basically find, for obvious reasons, the TCA concluded by the EU and the UK, which contains a precedentally specific and detailed provision, both from substantive and procedural level, which heavily draws from EU state aid law, obviously, including also an annex on energy and environmental subsidies. And then you have also some timid developments with respect to including provisions of fossil fuel subsidy, reform commitments, sometimes general, hortatory, non-enforceable, such as in the EU Singapore, but also something a bit more elaborated, such as in the EU New Zealand one, commitments to work towards the goal of reforming and progressively reducing fossil fuel subsidies, to cooperate to pursue reform in international fora, including the WTO, so there is promise in there. So, at the very end of the day, I'm not saying that there is, I mean, there's an irreversible trend, on the one hand, of including energy-specific provisions that are not just tackling classical energy security concerns, that it was the case in the previous agreements, but also incorporating systematically sustainability consideration. So, and then there is a progressively also standard, although not standardized, incorporation of energy sustainability-driven provisions with the primary goal to foster more environmental sustainable trade, energy trade, but with various levels of ambition. And in both cases, the most ambitious innovations concern a very limited number of agreements, but it does augur well for the purposes of trying to use energy disciplines in PTAs to increase these agreements' contribution to, contribute to climate change action. So I leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ilaria. And now we're going even more. We're attempting to take an even broader approach to the question with the presentation from Marius.
Thank you, Marcus. I think what we can learn from the EU-Mercosur history that Alessandra introduced is that negotiation can be tough and sometimes can even be politically impossible to either to conclude an agreement or, when you have already concluded an agreement, to renegotiate from the beginning. We saw recently with the Chile negotiation with Mexico, with the Samoa agreement that replaced the Cotonou, it may take a lot of time, and at the end, maybe the outcome may not be as ambitious as other examples, such as the EU New Zealand or EU Singapore were. So what we examine a little bit in our project is whether there are other flexible, more flexible actually approaches still within this FTA structure. And what we found out is that most of the EU agreements, even those that are less ambitious, still cover most of the matters that we discuss: subsidies, climate change, technology transfer, technical assistance, regulatory cooperation. What is different is rather the level of ambitiousness and also the level of the normativity, whether indeed they actually introduce binding obligations or not. And what we found in our research is that actually within the FTA and within the FTA committees, councils, or other institutions in general, the parties can actually introduce what we call agreement or sub-FTA level decisions, which do not lead to the formal amendment level of the treaty, but rather supplement the understanding of the parties or may operationalize some of the more soft law commitments that the parties have made. For instance, there are EU FTAs that have made the promise to liberalize green goods and services, but there is no annex or there is no agreement which are the green goods and services. The parties can, within the Trade in Goods Council of each FTA, can agree on this list and can move on based on this. Similarly, with regards to regulatory cooperation, we've seen some agreements having harmonization or the provision of equivalence with regards to green label or other similar sustainability-related labels. This can actually be done within the committees. Or, and Marcus mentioned the EU Central America. It is actually very, very progressive with regards to its language technology transfer, the protection of biodiversity, etc. But it's not actually binding, but rather invites the parties to build upon this institution that they have actually created. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that much of actual practice within those committees. And in a discussion I actually had in the COP in December with one of the members of the EU Commission in general about this, the excuse that I heard was, first, some of those agreements are not yet into force. But interestingly, a few weeks back, we saw the EU Canada issuing such an agreement with regards to the investment, even though the investment part of the CETA is not even yet enforced. It's not even provisionally enforced. So even though EU Central America is provisionally enforced, still the committees could do their work. Another issue is that, which indeed may be true for the older FTAs, is that some of the issues were not explicitly within their competence. So maybe climate change will not be mentioned, but still it's part of the environment, or it still could be part of their trade and goods council, for instance, or trade and services committee, etc. So, and to link this now to this balancing of commitments, in our research and also in previous papers, and I think all of us at CISDL share the same vision, is that indeed you should have very highly ambitious climate change obligations in free trade agreements, but on the other hand, you need to balance this by taking positive action as EU. On the one hand, this could be, for example, by promoting trade on green goods and services that can facilitate the implementation of the NDCs by its party, but on the other hand, what you can do is actually promote technology transfer, or, and this is one of the very well received recent examples, is to provide financing on very critical infrastructure and critical investments. And there is the EU-Kenya economic partnership that is to be soon to be ratified by the EU, which has a detailed annex on specific critical investments that need to be made, where the EU makes a commitment that either I will fund you, or I will find funding for this specific projects. And I think within the committees this can actually be done. And if we remember the 2022 EU FTA policy action plan, one of the things mentioned was that we need to agree on goals, timelines. Now, this doesn't require negotiating the FTA, but rather this can be discussed within the FTA to set plans and goals, and this can then go into the more granular level of execution. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marios. And I should perhaps highlight that it was really interesting for all of us as lawyers not to focus as much on the treaty text, but really review the Coordination Council, the Trade and Sustainable Development Council decisions and discussions that have been had in those ongoing treaty relationships. Now, Mateos worked very intensively over the last year with our community of practice. And so, Mateos, what is your impression on what the trading partners of the EU, especially based in Latin America, think about the sort of most recent developments?
Thank you very much, Marcus. I think it's quite an interesting point, and I'll start with what I've talked with a lot of communities, not only in Latin America, but especially outside, and is that the region is not, as they say in French, monolithique, right? So the region is not one thing, but rather we have different stakeholders, different industries, different partners that are at stake. So it's not one region. But if we can take, for example, a look at Brazil, where I come from, and I think Alessandra highlighted it very well. If we take a look at the agricultural sector, right, where the recent developments have been sort of the perfect excuse for it to say, let's take a look at the agreement, or let's push back a little bit. So it's difficult, to say the least, to give sort of an overview. But I think there is hope. So if we look, for example, in FTAs that already are in place, and I think this goes to what Marius was saying, if we look at the work that Javiera, which unfortunately has not been here, she's a researcher at the CISDL, and she has looked at, for example, the EU-Chile agreement. And if we look, and this goes back to Marius's point, if we look at the council decisions, there is some progress, right? So we have decisions that date to December of 2022 in the EU-Chile FTA that say that the parties are committed to the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. They are committed to not only economic growth, but decent work and sustainability and climate commitments. So this goes to show, and I think this is the bigger point of the value of this project, is that this is useful, right? So we can always amend the treaty, we can always sort of create a new one, that's fine, but there's value here and there's potential. And if we look at these decisions, the one I just mentioned about Chile, perhaps it shies away from big ambitions and it just sort of reiterates the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. But we want to sort of shed light to this and that there is hope, and this can serve as a fora for, you don't have to go back to ratification process to amend this. This is more fluid in this particular sense. Fluid, simple, but still valuable. And I think that's the message of the project. And if I were to sort of finish my remarks, I think I would say that I think this creates opportunities, right? So this is not just EU-Chile. This is not just EU-Mercosur. This is a vacuum, so to speak, that we can fill up, and we can foster the sustainability, foster the achievement of SDGs, and of economic growth as well, through these committee decisions. So I'll leave it at that because I think we still have running out of time. I think the interaction and Q&A I think is quite valuable. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so what we really want to do is hear from you and your impression where this sort of ongoing relationship and some of the innovations that we've seen in recent years of EU free trade agreements are going. So, yeah. Or do you have any questions for us in the first instance? Yes.
Yeah. So again, I'm from Fair Trade International, and
yes.
It will probably seem weird, and perhaps I should pay attention to the recording, but in Fair Trade, actually, we are not that strong on policy expertise on trade agreements, so I'm actually here also to learn and to understand the dynamics, etc. And so I have more questions than answers, or than contributions, and what would really, actually I want to put the questions back to you again from everything that you have observed on how the TSD chapters work, etc. in practice. Where do you really see that? You just said that yes, there is an opportunity to strengthen sustainability. How much is that really the case? How much they can really, transform the power relations that are there. I remember at the opening of this event, Pamela from ITC said the terms of trade have not changed for the last 300 years. So, how much, how much can they really change with those TSD chapters? And of course, Mercosur, all that is really relevant also to us because we have a huge producer network in Latin America. And we're still actually trying to really understand more in nuanced terms what the free trade agreements, either the old generation or the newer generation, really mean for smallholder farmers. And so far, I have the feeling, and probably I will need to look in more details than what you presented, but that it's difficult for me to access a really nuanced information on this question of smallholder farmers and free trade agreements. Some present this as a win-win and other as only lose-lose, or actually a big lose on the smallholder farmer side. So I'm really trying to understand what is the more nuanced information there, and also, perhaps how NGOs can also push there on making TSD chapters more, that they can be really a promise. So sorry, very broad questions, and I cannot really contribute in a useful way. I'm more looking at you for all this knowledge. I think.
No, and this is a very fair question, I'm sometimes not sure it's right to ask lawyers those kind of questions because our trade economist friends might have other answers. But what we've observed is that the TSD chapters are not just window dressing. They really go to the heart of the ongoing relationship. And that's why we think it's also important to discuss openly making climate change an essential element of the trading relationship, making maybe biodiversity in the future an essential element of these trading relationships, because it sets the tone of how the discussions in the Coordination Council and the Trade and Sustainable Development Committee are conducted. And to a certain extent, then it also, if it ever came to a dispute, the norm users would sort of rely much more on those kind of signaling functions rather than having everything just compartmentalized. It goes to the heart of how this agreement actually works. But yes, Alessandra is also a climate lawyer and works actually with small and medium-sized farmers. Can maybe
I was going to start off with this piece of information exactly, and I'm not sure I have a definite answer to your broad questions, but I think it's really interesting to consider the differences in approaches, because you mentioned that trade is a bit of a newer realm to your organization. And as I said, I am myself first and foremost a climate lawyer, and I also work in the climate policy realm. So I look at trade questions primarily with from a climate standpoint, and throughout this project, it's several iterations of this project, it became evident to me that perhaps we could minimize the friction between trade considerations and climate and sustainability considerations if we take into account differences in approaches. The climate regime is pretty much goals oriented. So we have the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. We have quantitative goals of reductions in GHG emissions. We have net zero. But at the same time, countries have quite a lot of wiggle room and flexibility in determining how, at the national level, they are going to get there. So it's pretty much a bottom-up approach, while the trade governance regime is pretty much a rules-based approach. So I think it's also up to us as policymakers and legal scholars to take a step back sometimes and take these differences in approaches into consideration, because sometimes it's a matter of the instrumental that you deploy to consider those questions. So your remark made me think of that realization. Thank you for that.
Yes.
Marcus, thanks. I was very happy that I've chosen this session, not the other sessions. I was hesitating for a brief moment, and I'm convinced I am in the right session. And thank you for all the rather positive news that I am happy to report back home to my colleagues. I am a practitioner. I am a free trade negotiator. I have, as part of my responsibility, to implement some of these provisions you refer to rather positively at times as having some impact. They're not just legal inflation, they create effects, and sometimes we can really implement them. And I say sometimes because I think we have to be honest with each other that not everything is easily implementable. Even if we have legally binding commitments, sometimes for an FTA to function properly, and I've seen that over the course of many committee work. I chair different committees, not the TSD committee in FTAs. I'm responsible for good regulatory practices or TBT committees or procurement committees, but especially in a bilateral agreement, you really need a good faith cooperative attitude from the partner. You cannot just subpoena them to court. You know, you cannot just say the law says this, you just sign up to this, it's legally binding now, you either do it or if else we see in court. That's not usually how it's done. It's a last recourse and it's typically very difficult to do it because you cannot just litigate forever, it takes time. And anyway, so this cooperative attitude is the one that matters a lot, and I think I would be very much interested in reading your papers, perhaps especially Mario's paper, where you said that sometimes even non-binding commitments are useful, and I would be very interested to see best practices. I am convinced that sometimes we manage to marry and create synergies between trade and sustainable development. In a previous session, I presented this firm-level evidence of small farmers in Africa being able to export in large quantities organic products to Europe. They even surpass major trading partners like UK or even Mexico in some products. Countries like Togo are the #1 exporters of organic products to Europe, and they comply with very stringent requirements. So we can do sustainable trade and development in these countries. I think the question is, how do we really select these soft law provisions? Because we will not have binding requirements on all our trade and sustainable agenda. We have a very ambitious agenda. The political environment in Europe is such that we are pushed into making trade a vehicle for everything that doesn't work otherwise. So when something doesn't work on its own, if you cannot do it on its own, well then ship it to the trade people. They might have a way to do it. So we overload the trade negotiating boat to the point of, at some point, we're even sinking. We have so many objectives. So we need to perhaps lower the requirements on our partners who are sometimes reluctant to even discuss these issues. So if we have a recipe for non-binding yet effective provisions, that would be extremely useful.
Yeah, Marius, do you want to come in and then we go around the table?
Yes, very quickly on the smallholders. So when you sign an FTA, a smallholder and SME would be primarily affected if you just open the market and big multinational corporations come in. But the question with regards to what the EU does is not really that it just liberalizes the market, but usually it comes with a big if that you actually have to comply. So it's not that there is a race to the bottom and a small and medium-sized enterprise cannot enter. Usually it is the vice versa, that to enter the EU, you need to comply with such rigid requirements that you are unable to do. And what we examine here is how, with these cooperative efforts within the committees, you can actually find ways to implement those higher standards that you may have, find specific programs within those committees. And one thing with regards to best practices, where the EU I've seen has been very active in FTA committees with decisions to grant mutual recognition agreements with regards to various, let's say for architects with Canada, that was something recent. And one thing that I want to see is how there it works so well, which again, it's EU and Canada, not EU with Chile or EU with all the different partners from the Cotonou now Samoa agreement, but still it is a process where gradually with the exchange of information and with the introduction of some guidelines or some, to put differently, some goals within the next few, let's say, let's meet again in 2 years to see how the regulation with regards to organic labels was implemented. And gradually with exchange of information, we can reach a level when it's not really required to impose an obligation. Please adopt the same regulation as I do, but rather with the exchange of information and gradually, and with the help of technical assistance and financing, you can reach a level. And as you said, the trade is always the second best policy. The best policy is directly go into that market to see and fix the market failure or the externality you think there is. And with the coordination or cooperation, maybe you can see with.
If I might add something very, very briefly, I think there's a fine line between promoting sustainability and climate objectives in trade agreements, and at the same time, we don't want to foster the creation of climate clubs, so to speak, and we also don't want to drive countries away from the Paris Agreement, because we all remember what happened with Kyoto.
Absolutely, right? But it's in perhaps slightly in defense of the EU. We also found in our research ample evidence that some countries that are now crying loudest about the CBAM were actually informed years ago that this was coming, right? And I'm sure the EU knows this, but we sometimes in the international discussions, forget that we were told, and it's minuted in the Trade and Sustainable Development Council of that bilateral relationship. Anyway, don't want to say more. What does Timor-Leste think about the EU's approaches?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I think Timor-Leste is a new member to WTO, but before.
Did you find the the accession negotiations with the EU cumbersome?
I don't have experience about the negotiation, but I'm very familiar with every people, and so with the Brazilian, with the American people, with the Australian people, with the Indonesian people, with the Asian people. So this is the first time I come here to be member to the WTO. But our experience my experience in Timor-Leste, I'm the director for quarantine and biosecurity. So very interesting about the sanitary and phytosanitary standard. So we need support for the capacity building for to establish sanitary and phytosanitary standard, follow the WTO standard, and we need establish law and regulation to control the export, import product to Timor-Leste. Before since long time ago, we import a lot animal product from the Brazil, and we import animal product from the US, and also from the ASEAN, Indonesia, and Australia. But we don't have any agreement. So now we already member to WTO. Of course, we need have a negotiation between the G to G, government and government, or how we can connection to the global trade investment or global trade. I think we need learn, and we need good communication with everybody. So that's why today I'm lucky between you in here. So you are, but I'm very familiar with the Mayara, you know me, right? So we will have in the next. Before I already busy to Brazil to made audit about the importing of chicken meat and pork and beef. But next month I will go back again to the Brazil for second audit for the continue sustainable import the animal product from Brazil to Timor-Leste, and also want to make audit with for the American animal product, especially for chicken leg quarter. But you know this or not, but I know because I consume the chicken leg quarter from America, and also a lot chicken from the Brazil. But you know or no, I don't know, but of course I know because I already consumed a lot chicken from the other country, like Indonesia, like Australian, like Brazil. So include fish and plant product, fruits and vegetable. So In legal base, of course, we need you how we can regular meeting, regular coordination between us, so we can share the information to control, so we can import a good quality product and then safe for everybody.
Yes.
Because the problem is now is in Timor-Leste, we have a problem with the foodborne disease,
Yes.
food safety and food security. So we very depend with the importation, but we start to try to production in the country.